Alright, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD, or Application and Website Development Program, and in particular, the AWD1100 C# Programming Language Fundamentals class, I've been doing a series of video presentations based on the textbook for the class, which as you can see is Muroc C# 2015. So far I've gone through all of sections 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm up to the end of section 5, which is on how to use the entity framework. And for this, looks like we have 4 applied objectives and 3 knowledge objectives. Applied. Create an entity data model that contains one or more entity classes. Use the entity model data model designer to work with an entity model. Use link to entities to retrieve data from one or more database tables. Use the entity framework to add, modify, and delete rows in a database table. In general terms, explain how entity framework works. Describe these terms as they relate to the entity data model, conceptual model, storage model, mappings, object context, entity class, navigation property, and association. And finally, explain how you can provide for concurrency when using entity framework. So, they're showing entity framework in here. There's nothing wrong with this picture, but it is possible basically to work with databases where you do virtually nothing with ADO.NET. At least not on the surface with ADO.NET. You run everything through the entity framework. So, that's not really what this chapter or this book talks about, so let's get into this. The entity framework, as mentioned here, provides a layer between the database used by the application and the objects used by the application. This layer provides an interface that allows the database data to be presented to the application as objects. To provide the interface, the entity framework uses an entity data model that defines a conceptual model, a storage model, and mappings between these two models. When you execute a query against a conceptual model, alright, as it says here, it's going to translate the query into one that can be executed by the database. When the results return from the database, they're translated back into objects. The entity framework also provides for tracking changes. Excuse me. And for submitting those changes to the database. So, 3 ways to query a conceptual model. The one that's discussed, the one that's most relevant in this book, is the one, to be honest with you, I have the least familiarity with, and that is link to entities. There's also entity SQL and query builder methods. So, when you start to work on this, notice here what we can do is we've got our choice. If we already have a database, we can work with that. If we already have code but no databases, so we can have the databases generate the code generate the databases. We can start with a model that's either empty or not empty, and we can add to it. Afterwards, we create our database connection. We decide which version of the entity framework you want to use. All right, and I think the newest is 6.3 something. And then, based on what we have available to us, we decide which table or tables, view or views, stored procedures and functions we want to be able to use. Now, if we look in here, all we're making available is the customers table and the invoice table. So the other tables do not exist in what we're doing right now. Once you select those and click Finish, the entity data model designer it doesn't really take over, but it's an EDMX file that what it has in here is basically the database schema. It doesn't show the type per se, but it shows all of the different fields. All right. Plus, if you do click on any field, you can go in and see the type. You can see whether or not it's a primary key, a foreign key, any constraints that are on it, etc. So here it says the model browser window with some of its nodes expanded. A mapping details window that explains the mapping for the invoice entity. Why would you want to do this? Well, if you really want to get intimate with the data, so to speak, where you really want to know what goes with what and how it links together, this is a way of doing so. All right. So here is a link query that gets data from an invoice table. You should already know this at least a little bit from what we talked about in the last chapter. From the invoice table, where the invoice total is greater than 200, we want to select the invoice ID and the invoice total and order them by invoice total in descending order. So there you go. Another example of a link query that gets invoice data through a customer object. All right. And again, I realize not going through these in really any depth and breadth of coverage. These will only make sense when we have the code up and running and we take a look at it. Okay? There's a try-catch statement that uses, it says, store wins for concurrency exceptions. We already know what concurrency is. That's when you have a situation set up where more than one user can open up the same table at the same time. And the worry then is if you've got two users who are changing the same table, and even more than that, are changing the same record in the same table, and they're doing it at virtually the same time, does one overwrite the other's changes? All right. So this is looking at the data source configuration wizard, I guess, in a little bit different way. All right, the customer maintenance form, we've talked about this kind of stuff before in an earlier chapter. You put a customer ID in there, you click the Get Customer button, it gets that information for you. All right, and I believe that other than the customer ID, you can change anything that's in here and click Modify. You can also, if there were 9 records in here, if you clicked Add, you should be able, if there's nothing here and you click Add, it should give you 10. That should all be blank and you can put in that information. You can also delete the current record. Typically, if you're going to do this, you're going to have some kind of a message here asking the user, are you sure you want to remove that? And then just exit to get out of the program. So here, the Add Modify, again, you can, when you click Add or really Modify, this changes to this. All right. So they have here the default entity data model and then the modified entity data model. Customer ID, name, address, city, state, zip code, state code. Not sure what has changed here, to be honest with you. All right, that's pretty much it. Like I said, not much for this chapter. We will take a look at some of these examples as a class. All right, so that finishes up this section. I realize it was only probably about 10 minutes, pretty close. So what's left? Next, when I come back, we're going to talk about how to enhance the user interface. This is kind of a hodgepodge or a miscellany of some of the things that haven't been talked about in much depth or breadth of coverage. All right, so far in our textbook. When we get done with that, we will talk about how to actually deploy an application. So, I will be back with those 2 lectures shortly.